Hi guys, a slightly odd starter for you here. Have a think about the season of spring, hopefully a distant memory by now. How would you describe it, both physically and metaphorically? So we're not thinking about those springy little things you see on the side. If you want, you can draw a picture as well. So come up with a few words to describe what spring would represent. So it would always be helpful to compare it to winter. Here we've got the first thing that came up on Google search when I found it. Winter represents death. It's chilly, it's cold, it's miserable, although personally I love it. Spring, on the other hand, is full of rebirth. It's full of life. It's warm, it's happier, it's more free, as we can see from this random woman strolling through a field without a care in the world. The reason I got you to do that is that in 1968, the capital of Czechoslovakia, Prague, seemed to be in its own version of spring for most of the entire year. This lesson we're going to be looking at what the Prague Spring was, why it happened, and next lesson we'll look at the consequences of it. Now, as a reminder, you can see Czechoslovakia just to the south of East Germany and Poland there. It's one of the countries which was deep in the control of the Soviet Union for pretty much all of the Cold War. We're going to look at why there was a Prague Spring. That can be bunched into three different reasons. So either use this video clip, which I'll attach, or the textbook to make notes on why Czechoslovakians demanded change in 1968. As you go through these, you're going to be thinking a lot about comparisons with Hungary in 1956, or at least I hope you are, because there are so many comparisons to be made here. So pause this video and either watch the clip or read the textbook, and we'll go over some of the key points together. Looking at communist rule in Czechoslovakia, you're going to see many different parallels to Hungary in 1956. First of all, you have long-standing memories of Stalin's salami tactics. 1968 was exactly 20 years since Czechoslovakia had been forced to become a communist country. The elections had been rigged, so communist votes had been double counted or triple counted, and non-communist votes had simply been ignored. Once the communists were in power, any opposition to them was crushed. Back in the third lesson of this entire course, I talked about Jan Masaryk, who had wanted Czechoslovakia to take martial aid when it was announced. You might remember that Truman had promised martial aid or money to help rebuild your country to any country in Europe. It wasn't just to the Democrats and the capitalists. But Stalin had blocked communist countries from taking it, seeing it as an American bribe, which it kind of was, to be honest. Masaryk died from an apparent suicide. He had defenestrated himself. It's a slightly odd thing in Prague's history, where multiple times throughout the last few centuries, politicians have been chucked out of a window. It was a slightly odd suicide for Masaryk in that he'd climbed out of a slightly awkward bathroom window, thrown himself out, and then shut the window after him. But this sort of repression carried on under Novotny, the ruler in 1968. In general, he closely followed instructions from the Soviet Union. He was the kind of puppet leader that Janos Kadar was after Imre Nagy had been replaced in the Hungarian uprising of 1956. In Hungary, you had the AVH, the secret police who could take you and arrest you or disappear you without warning. In Czechoslovakia, you had the STB, who would spy on and arrest you if you possibly said something against the communist Czechoslovakian government. On the other hand, Novotny had not followed Khrushchev's ideas of de-Stalinisation like some other Eastern European countries had. Remember, one point of the secret speech in 1956 was that Khrushchev criticised Stalin's excessive imprisoning of opponents. He still thought it was fine, but he thought the scale of it had been far too far and the cruelty had been far too much. Novotny in Czechoslovakia made no such change, so from 1957 up to 1968, you were generally imprisoned for doing anything which might be seen as against Czechoslovakian communism. Moving on to economy and the living standards. Czechoslovakia had some of the lowest living standards in Eastern Europe, particularly Slovakia. Remember, these are two countries which now exist as their own countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. In general, Slovakians tended to fare worse than their Czech national friends. Czechoslovakia overall had not benefited from the Comecon, another Stalin-era creation. With martial aid from Truman and America, Stalin created the Comecon to try and boost all of the Eastern European countries together. The idea was each country would focus on specific goods. That way they could share it amongst the Eastern European neighbours and they would all benefit. At least that was the theory. The problem is, Czechoslovakia had an excellent heavy industry. In particular, the steel, the quantity and the quality they produced was excellent. But they had to sell it to the Soviet Union at knockdown prices. In general, innovation was stifled. In other words, if a Czech person came up with a brand new idea or a new business, they were often told by the Soviet Union that is simply not allowed. In the 1970s, Prague had wanted to develop a world-beating underground system, a tube system, but they had to use inferior Soviet tube trains from 20 years previously. For the average person, consumer goods were either not produced or they were of shoddy quality. So again, like in East Berlin versus West Berlin, the East Berliners and the Czechoslovakians could do a really well-paid job, but not have a particularly good quality of life for it. Whereas if they could have gone across the border into Austria, they would have seen someone doing the same job and having a much, much better quality of life. Or they could have gone to a nicer area of their town or city and seen the local Communist Party members, where they would have access to luxury goods, from TVs to pineapples. Two very odd things to put together, but in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, your average Westerner was getting easy access to these sorts of things. It's so bizarre now to hear the idea of a TV being a luxury good, but that was a very middle class thing back then. Most people had radios rather than TVs, and even a pineapple. God knows why you'd want to eat one, but back then they were becoming accessible for your average working class or maybe lower middle class person. Not so in Eastern Europe. Those were the reserve of the Communist Party, or the ones that could really afford to bribe their way to getting it. The final and most important cause of the Prague Spring was Dubcek's leadership of Czechoslovakia. So Novotny had been the leader of the country for over 10 years, but he could not stop growing resentment and growing protests. So Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, agreed that Dubcek should replace him. Dubcek was personally popular, so hopefully he would stop the protests from growing, but more importantly, he had a proven record in the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. In Brezhnev's eyes, he was no radical, he was someone that could be depended on, just like Novotny could. But Dubcek would do things that Brezhnev would never dream of and never approve. He had a phrase to describe all of the types of changes that he would pursue for Czechoslovakia. Socialism with a human face. Now remember, in this course we treat socialism and communism as if they mean the same thing, even though they don't. Britain has socialist ideas such as the NHS. Socialism is where the government controls certain key industries for the good of the people. Communism is where the government controls everything for the good of the people. But that distinction doesn't really matter for our exam board. So you've got this weird thing where sometimes they say socialism when they mean communism. In any case, Dubcek's idea of socialism with the human face is a softer form of communism. It's really important to remember that Dubcek is a communist. He was a communist in 1968. He was a communist after the fall of communism in the 1990s. But his ideas in 1968 included free speech and press. In other words, you should be allowed to criticise the communist government. You should be allowed to write a newspaper criticising the communist government. He proposed fully democratic elections, including non-communist parties. This was even farther than Nagy had promised or wanted to promise in Hungary in 1956. He wanted trade with West Germany, one of their closest capitalist and democratic partners. He wanted to restrict the powers of the secret police, the STB, and he also wanted to leave the Comecon. He saw the Comecon as extracting money and productivity from Czechoslovakia. So he argued that Czechoslovakia would be much better as an independent communist country outside of direct Soviet control. That leads on incredibly well to Yugoslavia. Remember, we've talked about Yugoslavia before. It's one of the oddballs of communist Eastern Europe, because it had made itself communist without needing to be liberated by Stalin in World War II or straight afterwards. The leader of Yugoslavia, a man called Tito, Marshal Tito, to give him this title, didn't listen to the Soviet Union. So while Brezhnev was coming under pressure from other Eastern European countries like East Germany and Poland that were worried that Dubcek was setting a bad example, on the 10th of August 1968, General Tito, or Marshal Tito, visited Czechoslovakia and said, "What you guys are doing is fantastic." He even went so far as to say, "If you want help from us, we will be ready at a moment's notice." Now, Brezhnev was deeply worried by the 10th of August 1968. Tito's visit made things even worse. So Dubcek specifically said that Czechoslovakia would not pull out of the Warsaw Pact. Yugoslavia had never been in the Warsaw Pact, but Albania had. If you look at that map there, you can imagine Brezhnev's sleepless nights while this is going on, thinking about all of these countries slightly far away from the Soviet Union pulling out. Maybe Bulgaria will be next, or Romania, or Hungary, or, heaven forbid, East Germany. If East Germany stopped listening to the Soviet Union, what would stop East Germany from joining with West Germany with a certain couple of events going a different way? So Dubcek had specifically said that Czechoslovakia would not leave the Warsaw Pact because that had been the trigger for Hungary being invaded in 1956. None of this was acceptable to Brezhnev and the Soviet Union, so they demanded that Dubcek undo many of his promised changes. But Dubcek refused. So with all of that in mind, pause this video and have a think about these questions. From Brezhnev's point of view, what would be the pros and cons of allowing the Prague Spring to continue? I've gone into detail about the cons, the kind of nightmare scenario for the Soviet Union of other Eastern European countries pulling away from them. But on the other hand, why should he let this happen? Or what other possible disadvantages could there be? If you think about the Cuban Missiles Crisis 5 years ago and all of the agreements with the West in between then, you've also got the similar situation of a window to the West. It was even more acute or even more noticeable with East and West Berlin. But what if Czechoslovakia was a slightly capitalist country behind the Iron Curtain? Think about Tito's involvement being particularly worrying for Brezhnev, which we've already touched on, and then start to think about what do you think Brezhnev chose to do in reaction to the Prague Spring? And again, you can use Hungary 1956 as an inspiration there. The final thing is a stretching challenge. Looking back at your notes on the Hungarian uprising, thinking about the causes, what the Soviet Union did, and then the international reaction to it. Think about to what extent the fact that Hungary happened was a lesson not learned for the Soviet Union. In other words, they don't seem to do much in reaction to the Hungarian uprising. They invade, they kill 20,000 Hungarians, but in terms of concrete changes, there's really nothing between 1956 and 1968. So could they have done something differently to have prevented the Prague Spring from happening? So that is all the details on the causes and events of the Prague Spring. Next lesson, we'll go into detail onto the consequences.